It's Father John again. Yes, and this time we're going to talk about, how about creating God? And why would we want to do this? Why would we want to create God? For thousands of years we've been believing that God created us, and now there are some people who say that the only reason we believe in God is because we created him ourselves so that we would have someone to handle all our problems. All right. We're going to create God. We're going to create the sort of God that we think should be looking after us today. Will it work? Let's have a look. How do we do this? How are we going to create a God? Well, first we're going to look at the attributes that a God would have. The sort of attributes that we want our God to have. Let's start with sex. Yes, I know. In the Bible, Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, I think, it says that God created mankind, male and female created he them, and they were created in his image. Does that mean that God is a hermaphrodite? Does that mean that God is bisexual because there's male and female parts? I think it's easier for us to think of God as being beyond sex, beyond the constraints of male, female, or whatever other things that we're thinking of. So let's forget all this thing about him and Father. Let's just call God, God, the one that we are going to create. Now the next thing we need is for this God to be eternal, to have existed before creation. One of the problems when we're thinking about eternity is that we're thinking from now to the end of all time as being eternity, but it also goes back in time. There must have been an eternity when this God existed before we were created, if you believe all of that. So for millennia, for thousands of millions of billions of years, this creature lived alone. Oh, but you say that's all right because God was in heaven with all the angels. There must have been a time before the angels were created. There must have been an immense period of time when God existed with nothing else in the universe. Not a thing. Now, if you put somebody into solitary confinement, they will go mad. Has that happened to God? To the Christian God, to the God of the Jews, the God of the Christians, the God of Islam? Is it true that this God that they have created has existed for so long that there's a mental illness because there's been no companionship? But we do want this God to be eternal, so we've got to find a way around all of that. Unless, of course, God was created in 4004 BC at the same time as everything else was created, if you want to accept the Christian attitude to that. All right. We also want this God to be powerful, to be the ultimate source of power. Otherwise, a person's not a God. The deity is not a God if it is not all-powerful. Not all powerful. Okay. That would imply that if there's a natural disaster, this particular God would be able to stop it, would have the power to stop it. This same God would have the power to avoid birth defects. This same God would make sure that thousands and thousands of children do not die in tsunamis, in other natural disasters. If God can't stop that, it's not a God, not the sort of God I want to know. An all-powerful God either stops these things from happening or is unable to stop them or is unwilling to stop them. All right, let's talk about knowledge. Let's talk about the sort of knowledge that this God would have. This God would know all about future developments. This God would know that a child born with a birth defect may not live for 5 years, may not live for 5 minutes. You would think that the knowledge that this God would have would also assist this God in making sure that no harm came to its creations. Also, we would want to have a God who not only has knowledge of the future, but has a way of avoiding problems. For example, the Christian God and the Jewish God destroyed, murdered, killed millions of people in a little thing called the flood. Wouldn't you think that if God thought ahead and knew that there was going to be a flood because he was going to create it, and knew that there was going to be 8 people alone, only 8 people saved, and those 8 people would be on an ark, and that would be Noah's ark, wouldn't you think that if God was aware of that, why would he go to all the trouble of creating Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and all these other people, plus of course Cain and Abel's sisters, but we won't go into that at the moment? Wouldn't you think that God would say, look, if they're all going to sin against me and not do the right thing, let's start creation with Noah. It'd be so much simpler. Foreknowledge would do that. Another thing is, if we were to create a God, we would also want that God, knowing about what's going to happen in the future, to at least put something in the Bible about a simple thing like washing your hands. The ancient prophets knew nothing about germs. They knew nothing about medicine. Yet, if God knew all these things, why couldn't God just put something in the Bible saying, listen, wash your hands after you finish your dinner. Wash your hands after you attend to certain bodily functions. It doesn't hurt. Just wash your hands. Not a word about it. Not one word. Not one word. Compassion. There was no compassion shown there. There's no compassion shown in the creation of sin. Now, this is an interesting thing. If we want to have a God, do we want this God to actually be responsible for sin in the world? Now, sin, of course, is an old Catholic and Protestant and Jewish concept. That is, that people sin against God. Remember the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that was found in the Garden of Eden. If God didn't want us to eat of that, why put it there? Why not just leave it alone? God supposedly knew that someone was going to want to bite that apple on the tree. Why not just leave it out of the Garden of Eden? Why not just have a little bit of compassion and say, hey, I can avoid a lot of misery in my creation if I just don't create sin? We want a God who is so powerful that 1/3 of his angels aren't going to rebel against him. Doesn't seem very powerful to me. We want a God that is compassionate. So what's the Christian God? The Christian God has a place called hell, where you will be punished for all eternity. Of course, it's for the rest of eternity, not for all the past, but from this point on. When we die, we are supposed to be punished in hell because we broke some little rule that this supposed God has for us. This is not compassion. This is being petty. This is being... I almost said it sounded like it was presidential, but we'll leave American politics out of this. What we're looking for is a God that would be not only compassionate, but fair. Tell me, what did the kangaroos do to God? What did the platypus do to God? What did the bear do to God? What did the birds of the air do to God? Why is it then that when all the people except for 8 were killed during the flood, he also killed all the animals, all the birds, all other things like that? By the way, talking about the kangaroo, isn't it amazing how after the flood, the kangaroo hopped all the way from Mount Ararat to Australia and never left one bone of one dead kangaroo anywhere to be found at all. An amazing kangaroo. Okay, we also want an efficient God. Why do we want a God to be efficient? We don't want him to be wasting time. When we have a problem and we want to put it to our God, we don't want him somewhere over in Ursa Minor or some other galaxy somewhere looking after a lump of rock that might be in the wrong spot. We want him here. We want him looking after us. We want an efficient God, a God who will look after us. Why would God want to create worlds that we will never visit? Come to think of it, why would God even want to create a plan of salvation for people when 2/3 of the people on the earth will never hear of it? Have a look at what they say in the various churches today. They say that everything was created 4004 BC. So that means that we have approximately 2/3 of human time on this earth without any knowledge of Jesus, and 1/3 with knowledge. Too bad about the 2/3 of the people who never got to find out about him. That doesn't seem to me to be a very good plan. So what was the plan for? Was it to create a world that God would want? Possibly. And then he goes and creates man to be a farmer, to look after his garden. Nah. Was the plan made for us? Not apparently, because the particular God that I'm complaining about basically has condemned most of us to spend all eternity in hell. Not very nice. The modern day Christian will talk to you about free will, about how we all have the right to exercise will. Well, let's have the right to create a God that respects us, a God who keeps his word, a God who doesn't destroy innocent children. How about we create a God who actually cares? All right, so the current God that the Christians have, is he a good God? Is he an evil God? Or is he neither? Does he even exist? I maintain that the Christian God does not exist. So we need to create our own God. How can we do that? Maybe we should be looking internally instead of externally. Maybe we should be looking at the spirit that's within us, the knowledge that's within us, our very brains, our very attitude to life. Maybe we should be looking at a collective consciousness, if you like. Maybe we should be looking for some of these people that God tells us to avoid. Maybe they've got the answer. Oh, Father Satan, that's an interesting thought. But the main thing for us at the moment is to realize that the God that the Christians have created is a very poor imitation of what we really need. And we'll talk a bit later about other things. Thank you for coming back for this one, and as I always say, hail Satan.